I'm Kristen Seefeld, and I'm going to talk to you about understanding and writing policy memos. So first, we need to understand what a policy memo is. It's really different from kind of writing than the usual academic paper. It's designed for a reader who needs to have an understanding of an issue so that they can make an informed decision. The memo may even offer some recommendations, which I'll touch upon in a moment. But this reader doesn't have the time to read a lengthy paper, so policy memos are brief, usually not more than 5 pages and typically even shorter than that. We usually think about policy memos as being used by elected officials to inform them about an issue before they have to cast a vote or make some other kind of decision. But really, a policy memo can be prepared for anyone who needs to make a decision about a particular issue, including leaders of organizations or even the general public. We often advise those who are writing policy memos to keep in mind that no matter the audience, the reader is busy. They don't have time to conduct the in-depth research on an issue. That's your job as the writer. And they don't have time to read through many pages to get to the information that they need. So there's no one standard format that everyone and every organization uses for a policy memo. If you would look online, you'd see many different models. Different policy schools even have different approaches to writing policy memos. So when you're given the task of writing a policy memo, you should pay attention to the instructions given by your instructor or follow the practices used by your place of work. This is what a policy memo looks like, and I'll go through each one of these sections in turn. So the first at the top is the header. So this is something that's pretty standard in any kind of memo, a policy memo, an interoffice memo, anything like that. It tells you who the recipient is, who wrote it, when it was written, and what the subject matter is. Now we'll turn to the introduction. So the introduction should be very brief. No more than 1 to 2 paragraphs, and usually preferably 1 paragraph. It should tell the reader what's in the document and most importantly, what conclusions you drew or recommendations you're giving. Sometimes the introduction might be replaced with an executive summary. So typically we think of executive summaries as giving us an overview of a much longer document. It gives the highlights from each part. But since policy memos by nature are short, your introduction may actually function like an executive summary. Basically, you want the reader to be able to glean the contents of the entire memo from reading the beginning, whether that's an introductory paragraph or whether that's in the form of an executive summary. So then there's the background section. I like to think of a reader of a policy memo as someone who's generally informed about an issue, who's an interested reader, but they don't necessarily know about the specifics. However, they're not someone who's starting from scratch. So when you're deciding about how much background information to provide in a policy memo, you might want to ask yourselves a couple of questions. So one is, why would the reader need to know this particular piece of background information? If it's key to understanding the conclusion or recommendation you're making, then okay, put it in. But if it's just background information for the sake of providing background information, you might want to think about leaving it out. So to give you an example, I've put in here a paragraph about a policy memo that might be about changing the US personal income tax code. Now that might sound really dry, but it's an issue that is sort of perennially up for debate. Whether or not the tax system is too complicated. People might argue that the rates are incorrect, either they're too high or too low, something like that. So in this example, I have the first 2 sentences of this paragraph give us some background information about when income taxes first came into code in the United States. So they were a part of the passage of the 16th Amendment. The next 2 sentences, though, tell us a little bit about what tax rates actually are, how income is taxed, and what the various rates are. So would you actually need the first 2 sentences? Maybe, if the assignment is one that wants you to provide a historical background of income taxes. But if your assignment is really to inform a busy policymaker about what the issues are around changing the tax code, you probably don't need to go into a great deal of history, and you could cut the first 2 sentences. The next section is the analysis of the issue, and how you handle the analysis will really vary depending on the assignment. You might, for example, look at the pros and cons of various approaches, changing the tax code so that the top tax rate is 40% instead of 35%. You could look at the pros and cons. You could examine the feasibility of different options. Would it really be feasible to have an income tax rate of 40%? Would the public vote like it? Would other legislators vote for it? But no matter what, no matter the approach you take, your analysis should really draw on relevant evidence and data, not necessarily your personal feelings or what you think is right. Use hard data to back up your claims. The last part is the conclusion. In the conclusion, you're basically summarizing either what your analysis led you to conclude, and in some cases you're actually going to make recommendations. You might say, based on the analysis I did, I believe you, Legislator Smith, should vote for an increase of the top tax code to 40%. So that's really it. Those are the basic parts of a policy memo. As I said, these are short documents, so there's not a whole lot to them in terms of content. But you want to make sure that every word and every sentence counts. You want to be concise. So when I tell students about writing policy memos, I tell them that they want to make every piece of information count and they want to make every single word count. Get rid of unnecessary words. Use short sentences. Get rid of content that might be interesting, but it's not necessarily relevant to the argument at hand. Second tip, be organized. Use headers for different sections. Depending on the length and depending on the content, you might even want to use subheaders for different sections. This is a type of writing too where listing out things by bullet points or by numbers might be really helpful. And finally, be very straightforward and be upfront. This is a paper where you don't want to build up to a conclusion. You want to tell your reader the conclusion right up front. Say it right in the beginning and say it again in the end. And be straightforward again about your language choices. Shorter words are better, simple words are better, and to the extent possible, avoid jargon so that the reader knows immediately what you're saying. There's lots of resources online for looking at policy memos, but here was just a brief overview, and hopefully this will demystify some of the mystery surrounding this type of writing.